Bud Not Buddy, Chapter 8, Part 2. So, Mr. Hero, we're the same age, but you have been staying in an orphanage? I've been staying in a home. My daddy says being on the road ain't fit for a dog, much less a kid. How come you just don't go back to your orphanage? She started touching my hand too much again. Desi Malone seemed like she was all right, so I came clean with her. Don't tell no one, but I lit out from the foster home, so I'm on the lam. And I wouldn't go back to the home even if I could. It's getting so there's too many kids in there. So? That's better than being cold and hungry all the time and dodging the railroad police. Well, what do you mean? You don't think they just let people jump on the trains, do you? Well, I guess I hadn't thought about that. See, I knew you were too nice to have been out on the road. You're going to have a big surprise tomorrow morning. That won't bother me too much. She said, Oh, yeah? I forgot. You're a hero to some folks. When Deza smiled, a little dimple jumped up in her brown cheek. I didn't answer. I just kept drying tin cans. We got to the last 4 or 5 tin can plates, and Deza said, You ever kissed a girl in the orphanage? Uh-oh. Are you kidding? No. Why are you afraid of girls? You must be kidding. She said, Okay, and closed her eyes and mushed her lips up and leaned close to me. Dangy! If I didn't kiss her, she'd think I was scared of girls, and if I did kiss her, she might blab or Bugs might see me and tell strangers about what happened. I looked down the creek to where Bugs and the other boy were still splashing in the water. It was dark enough that I didn't think they could see us too good. So I scooched my lips up and smashed my face on Desi Malone's. We stuck like that for a hot second, but it felt like a long time. When I opened my eyes and pulled back, Desi kept hers closed and smiled. She looked down and stuck her hand in mine, and this time I let her keep it there. She looked out at the creek and the woods on the other side and said, Isn't this romantic? I looked out to see what she was talking about. The only thing I could see was the moon, like a big egg yolk up in the sky, way up in the sky. You could hear the water and the sound of the mouth organ man playing a sad song back in Hooverville. I sneaked another peek at Dez's dimple. She said, You hear that? That's Shenandoah. He's playing. Isn't it pretty? I guess so. Do you know the words? Uh-uh. Listen. It's been 7 long years since I've last seen her. Way hey, you rollin' river. Been 7 long years since I've last seen her. Way hey, I'm bound away. Cross the wide Missouri. I said, Yep, that's a sad song. I didn't think it was pretty at all. She squeezed my hand and said, Isn't it? It's about an Indian man and woman who can't see each other for 7 years, but in all the time they stay in love, no matter what happens. It reminds me of my mother and father. Your dad's been gone for 7 years before? She looked out over the creek like a big eggy moon had hypnotized her. I pulled my hand from hers and said, Well, that's just about it for the dishes. She smiled again. Bud, I'll never forget this night. I didn't tell her, but I probably wouldn't forget it either. I'd practiced on the back of my hand before, but this was the first time I'd ever busted slob for a real live girl. We loaded all the dishes in the box and walked down to Bugs and the other kid. We put their dishes on top of ours and headed back. Bugs said, How come you look so strange, Bud? You look like you've been chucked in the head with a rock. Desi Malone laughed, and for a second I thought she was going to rat me out. I said, I don't know. I guess that song is making me kind of sad. Bugs said, Yeah, it is kind of sad. Right before we got to the cardboard jungle, we passed the white people with their coughing baby at their own little fire. I said to Deza, How come they're off alone? They aren't allowed to sit around the big fire because the baby's making so much noise? Deza said, They've been invited, but my daddy said you got to feel real sorry for them. All they're eating is dandelion green soups. They're broke. Their clothes are falling off of them. Their baby's sick. But when someone took them food and blankets, the man says, Thank you very much, but we're white people. We ain't in need of a handout. When we got back to the main fire of Hooverville, we put the dishes in another box. Deza made us turn them all upside down, so if it rained, turn them upside down, so if the rain got into them, they wouldn't rust. I went to the woman with my suitcase. I was in the same spot It was in the same spot that I had left it, and the knots and twine were the kind I tied. I said, "Thank you very much, ma'am." She said, "I told you not to worry." I went back to the big fire to sit with Bugs. The mouth organ man said, "I suppose you boys are going out on the train tomorrow." I said, "The one for Chicago, sir?" He said, "That's the one." I said, "Yes, we are." He said, "Well, you'd best get as much sleep as you can. It's supposed to be pulling out at 5:15, but you never know with these freights." We got in one of the shacks with some other boys. Bugs was snoring in 2 seconds, but I couldn't sleep. I opened my jackknife and put it under my blanket. I was thinking, Dez's mom was right. Someone who doesn't know who their family is just like dust blowing around in a storm. They don't really belong in any one place. I started wondering if going to California was going to be the right thing to do. I might not know who my family was, but I knew they were out there somewhere, and it seemed to make a whole lot more sense to think that we're around Flint, somewhere around Flint instead of out west. I opened my suitcase to get my blanket. Even though I trusted the woman who guarded it for me, I checked to make sure everything was okay. I picked up the tobacco pouch that had my rocks in it and pulled the drawstring open. I shook the 5 smooth stones out and looked at them. They'd been in the drawer after the ambulance took Mama away, and I had had them ever since. Someone had took a pen or something and writ on all 5 of them, but it was written in code, so I couldn't understand what they meant. One of them said Kentland, Illinois, or Ill, 5:10:11. Another one said Lugatui Inn, 5:16:11. Then there was Sturgis M, 8:30:12, and Gary N, 6:13:12, and the last one said Flint M, 8:11:11. I put them back in their pouch and pulled the string tight. And then I pulled out the envelope that had the picture of the saggy pony at the Misbegotten Moon Park. It was fine. Next, I counted the flyers again. All 5 were there. I slid all of them back, except the blue one. I held it up so I could catch some of the light by the big fire. I kept looking at the picture and wondering why this one bothered Mama so much. The more I thought about it, I knew that this man just had to be my father. Why else would Mama keep these? I used a little trick to help me fall asleep. I put my blanket right over my head and breathed in the smell real deep. After doing this 3 times, the smells of the shack in Hooverville were gone, and only the smell of blanket was in my nose. And that smell always reminded me of Mama and how she used to read me to sleep every night. I took 2 more breaths and pretended I was hearing Mama reading to me about the 3 billy goats gruff, or the fox and the grapes, or the dog that she saw reflection in the water, or some other story she had checked out at the library. I could hear Mama's voice getting farther and farther away as I imagined I was in the story, until finally her voice and the story all mixed up into one. I'd learned that it was best to sleep before Mama finished the story, because if she got done and I was still awake, she'd tell me another story. Tell me what the story was about. I never told Mama, but that always ruined the fun for the story. Shucks, here I was thinking I was just hearing something funny about a fox or a dog, and Mama spoiled it by telling me there really were lessons about not being greedy or not wishing for things you couldn't have. I took 2 more breaths and started thinking about the little hen that baked the bread. I heard, "Not I," said the pig. "Not I," said the goat. "Not I," said the big bad wolf. Then whoop, zoop, sloop, I was asleep. I started dreaming as the man with the giant fiddle. About the man with the giant fiddle. He was walking away, and I kept calling him, but he couldn't look back. Then the dream got a lot better. I turned away from where Hermione Calloway was, and there stood Deza Malone. I told her, "I really like your dimple." She laughed and said, "See you in 7 years." A man screamed, "Get up! They're trying to sneak it out early." I jumped straight up and banged my head on the top of the shack. I ran outside. It was still dark, and the fire was just a pile of glowing sticks. The man was screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get up! They've fired the engine, and they're fixing to take off." Bugs and the other boys came and stood next to me. Bugs said, is it a raid?" Someone said, "No, they're trying to sneak out before we get up." People started running all over Hooverville, Bugs said. Come on, Bud, get your stuff. We got to get on that train. I folded my blanket up and put it in my suitcase and tied the twine back. I put my jackknife in my pocket, and Bugs and I ran outside. I hadn't got 6 giant steps away when a boy stuck his head out the door and yelled, Hey, Slim, is this your paper? I looked back. My blue flyer. I forgot to put it back in my suitcase. Bugs says, Hurry, I'll wait. I'll catch you. Go ahead. I ran back and took my flyer from the boy. Thanks a lot. I ran back out into the crowd and was tearing through the woods. There were a million men and boys running in the same direction. I didn't want to fold the flyer up, so I was running. I slid it between the twine and the suitcase. I'd put it back inside once we got on the train. No one was talking. All you could hear were the sounds of a million feet smacking on the trail and the sound of a million people trying to catch their breath. Finally, a hiss sound started getting louder and louder, and I knew we weren't too far away. We broke out into the woods, and there in the dark sat the train. The locomotive was hissing and spitting coal-black smoke into the sky. Every once in a while, a big shower of sparks would glow up from inside the dark cloud, making it look like a gigantic black genie was trying to rise up out of the smokestack. The train went as far back as I could see, and there must have been 1,000 boxcars. But everyone had stopped and was just standing there watching. No one was trying to get on. I pushed my way to the front to see if I could find Bugs, and saw why everyone had stopped. There were 4 cop cars and 8 cops standing between the crowd and the train. The cops all had billy clubs and were spread out to protect the train. The crowd kept getting bigger and bigger, and one of the cops yelled, You men know you can't get on this train. You just go back to Shantytown and there won't be no trouble. And a white man said, This is the only train going west for the next month. You know we've got families to feed and have got to be on it. You go get back in your cars and you'll be right. There won't be no trouble. The cop said, I'm warning you, the Flint police are on their way, and this here is private property, and they have orders to shoot anyone who tries to get on the train. A man next to me said, I'd rather be shot than sit around and watch my kids go hungry. The cop said, This is America, boys. You're sounding like a bunch of commies. You know I can't let you get on this train. I've got kids to feed too, and I'd lose my job. And someone yelled, Well, welcome to the club, brother. It seems like we stood looking at the cops and them looking at us for a whole hour. Our side was getting bigger and bigger, and the other cops started looking nervous. The one who was doing all the talking saw them fidgeting and said, Hold steady, men. One of the cops said, Jake, there's 400 men out there and more coming. I don't like these odds. Mr. Pinkerton ain't paying me enough to do this. He threw his cop hat and his billy club on the ground. Everybody froze when the train whistle blew one long time and the engine started saying, shh, 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 shh. The big wheels creaked a couple of times, then started moving. 4 of the other cops threw their hats and billy clubs down too. The boss said, You lily-livered rats. And it was like someone said, On your mark, set, go. The engine was saying, shh, 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 shh. And a million boys and men broke for the train. I got pushed from behind and fell on top of my suitcase. Someone reached down and pulled me up. I squeezed my bag to my stomach and ran. The train was going faster and faster. People were jumping on and reaching back to help others. I finally got to the tracks, and I was running as hard as I could. I looked up into the boxcar, and I saw Bugs. He screamed, Bud, throw your bag! Throw me your bag! I used both hands to throw my suitcase on the train. Bugs caught it. And when he set it behind him, the blue flyer flew out of the twine and fluttered outside the door. But it was like a miracle. The flyer flipped over 3 times and landed right in my hand. I slowed down and put it in my pocket. Bud reached one arm out and screamed, Bud, don't stop, run! I started running again, but it felt like my legs were gone. The car with Bugs in it was getting farther and farther away, and finally I stopped. Bugs was leaning out the door and stopped reaching back for me. He waved and disappeared into the boxcar. A second later, my suitcase came flying out of the door. I walked over to where it landed and picked it up. Man, this is one tough suitcase. You couldn't even tell me what all it had been through, and it still looked exactly the same. On the side of the tracks, I sat on the side of the tracks and tried to catch my breath. The train and my new pretend brother got farther and farther away, chugging to Chicago. Man, I'd found some family, and he was gone before we could really get to know each other. There were 6 or 7 people who didn't make the train, so we all walked back toward Hooverville. They must have lit the big fire again. The sky in that direction was glowing orange. The cop that first threw down his billy club walked over to us and said, "He wasn't lying about Flint police coming, but they're coming to bust up the shanty town. You all should get out of here." When we got close to Hooverville, we heard 4 gunshots. We all spread out into the woods and sneaked up to see what had happened. I peeked from behind the tree and could see a bunch of cops standing around with pistols out. All of the men and boys and women that were left in the Hooverville were bunched up on one side, and the cops were on the other. The fire had been lit and was burning bigger than ever, but now it was burning because the cops were tearing all the shacks down and were throwing the wood and cardboard and hunks of cloth into the middle of it. One of the cops grabbed the big clothes washing pot over onto its side and stuck his pistol down in it and shot 4 more times. Whew. Instead of shooting people, they were shooting holes into all of the pots and pans. A man was yelling, "You yellow-bellied lowlifes! You waited till you knew most of the men were gone, you cowards!" The cops wouldn't talk or nothing. They just kept piling Flint's Hooverville into the fire. I tried to see if I could spot Des Malone, but there were too many people. It seemed like the only good thing that came out of going to Hooverville was that I finally kissed a girl. Maybe someone was trying to tell me something. What with me missing the train and the blue flyer floating back to me, and Des Malone was right. Maybe I should stay here in Flint. I walked back farther into the woods and I sat down. I put the blue flyer in my I pulled the blue flyer out of my pocket and opened my suitcase back up. I smoothed the flyer out and took another good look at it. Maybe it came floating right back to me because this Hermione Calloway really was my father. Wait a minute, I sat up. The names Caldwell and Calloway are a lot alike. Both of them have 8 letters, and there aren't too many names that have C-A-A-A-L and a W all together like that. I remembered what I read in a little big book, Gangbusters. It said a good criminal chooses an alias that's kind of close to their own name, except I couldn't figure out who the criminal was here and why anybody needed an alias. I wanted to stay and look for Des and her mother, but it was too hard to hear all the people crying and arguing. Besides, I was still on the lam. I started walking, and if I hurried, I could get to the breakfast at the mission.